She stepped down from the rattling train with a single suitcase and a heart full of carefully guarded hope, the dust of the frontier swirling around her boots as if the land itself were uncertain about her arrival, and as she scanned the platform she told herself, again, that she hadn't come for comfort or romance or riches, only for stability, only for survival, because the letter had been clear. A poor farmer, honest, hard-working, owning little more than land too dry to yield much, and yet willing to offer marriage in a world that had offered her nothing but closed doors and whispered judgments, and when she finally saw him standing apart from the others, broad-shouldered, weather-worn, dressed in clothes patched more times than she could count, her heart sank just a little, not from fear but from resignation, because this, she thought, is exactly what I signed up for, a hard life beside a man shaped by dirt and silence, and when he spoke his voice was calm, measured, respectful, not the desperate tone she had expected from a man advertising for a wife, and that unsettled her more than his rough hands or his quiet gaze, because desperation she understood, but this felt like certainty, and the ride to his farm only confirmed what she feared as the land grew emptier, the road narrower, the cabin smaller, the soil cracked and pale beneath the sun, and when he showed her the house, one room, rough timber, simple tools, she smiled politely while her chest tightened, already calculating winters, hunger, loneliness, wondering whether she had traded one kind of poverty for another, and that night as the wind rattled the walls and coyotes cried in the distance she lay awake staring at the ceiling, rehearsing a future made of endurance rather than joy. But the next morning he rose early and asked her to come with him, not to work, not to cook, just to walk, and they followed a narrow path behind the hills where the land suddenly changed as if the earth itself had been hiding a secret, green fields rolling outward, fences stretching farther than her eyes could follow, cattle grazing in quiet abundance, barns standing solid and strong, windmills turning steadily against the sky, and in that moment the truth settled over her like a wave, not shock, but understanding, as he explained without pride that the poor farm was a choice, a shield, a test, because wealth in this land attracted the wrong kind of attention and he had learned long ago that revealing too much too soon cost him trust, safety, and peace, and as she listened she realized the letters had never lied, only omitted, because what he truly owned wasn't just land or livestock but patience, foresight, restraint, the rare power to remain humble in a world obsessed with display, and suddenly the silence that once felt heavy now felt safe, the simplicity intentional, the roughness honest, and as days passed she saw how workers respected him, how neighbors relied on him, how quietly he gave without being seen, and the love that grew between them wasn't born of wealth revealed but of character uncovered, because what moved her most wasn't the size of the land but the fact that he had never once used it to impress her, never tested her with temptation, only with truth. And when she finally told him she would have stayed even if the cabin had been all there was, he smiled. Not with relief, but with something deeper, something earned. And that is when she understood the real lesson of her journey, that the greatest riches are often hidden behind humility, that strength doesn't announce itself, that love worth keeping never begins with illusion. And if this story moved you, if you believe that real character still matters in a loud and shallow world, then don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Because stories like this, stories of quiet power, unexpected truth, and love built on something real, are waiting for you right here. As the weeks passed, the land no longer felt like something she was merely standing on but something she was slowly becoming part of, learning its rhythms, its silences, the way dawn arrived gently over the hills and dusk settled like a promise kept, and with each passing day she noticed things she hadn't before. The careful way he inspected fences not out of fear but foresight, the way men twice his size waited for his word before acting, the way disputes ended quietly when he arrived, not because he raised his voice but because his presence carried weight, and one evening as they sat outside the small cabin watching the sky darken, she finally asked the question that had been growing inside her, why hide it, why live small when you could live openly, and he didn't answer right away, instead staring across the land as if the past were written into its soil. Then he told her about the years before. About greed disguised as friendship, about how once people knew what he owned they stopped seeing him and only saw what they could take, how partnerships turned into betrayals, how admiration turned into entitlement, and how loneliness had followed him even in the middle of abundance. And as he spoke she realized that his greatest fear was not losing his land but losing peace, and suddenly the modest cabin made sense, the poor clothes, the quiet life, because it filtered people, revealed intentions, and protected what truly mattered. And it dawned on her that she hadn't been tested by poverty at all but by perception, by whether she could see value without spectacle. And that night as she lay beside him she understood she hadn't married a poor farmer who turned out to be rich. She had married a powerful man who chose restraint. And when trouble finally came, as it always does, it came swiftly, outsiders arriving with smiles too practiced and questions too sharp, men who had heard whispers of land, water, cattle, and opportunity, and she watched as he handled them with calm precision, never threatening, never boasting, setting boundaries so firmly they felt immovable. And for the first time she saw herself not as a rescued bride but as a partner standing beside a force she deeply respected. And when those men left, unsettled and empty-handed, she felt a quiet pride rise in her chest, not in what they owned but in who he was. And as the seasons turned and the farm expanded openly now, with trust earned and risks calculated, she took her place fully, managing, planning, building, becoming the woman the land required her to be. And in doing so she realized the story she would one day tell was not about a poor farmer who surprised her with wealth, but about a man who taught her the rarest lesson of all. That true power whispers, true love waits, and the greatest fortunes are revealed only to those patient enough to see beyond the surface. And if you're still listening, still drawn into stories where depth matters more than display and character outweighs appearance, make sure you subscribe to the channel, because stories like this don't just entertain. They change how you see the world. Years later, when people spoke of the land they no longer spoke of it in acres or cattle counts but in stories, stories of how it survived droughts that broke stronger men, how disputes ended before they began, how prosperity arrived without arrogance, and at the center of every story stood the man who once pretended to own nothing and the woman who had arrived with only a suitcase and the courage to trust. And she often thought back to that first day, to the cracked soil and the small cabin, realizing now that it had all been a kind of doorway, not into wealth but into wisdom, because what he had given her was not comfort but clarity, not illusion but truth, and together they built something far greater than a fortune. They built a reputation rooted in fairness, restraint, and quiet authority. And when their children asked why they still lived simply despite owning so much, she told them that wealth should support a life, not consume it, that power should protect, not impress, and that love should be chosen every day without being bribed by appearances. And on the evening when the sun dipped low and painted the fields gold, she stood beside him once more on the hill overlooking everything they had grown together, understanding fully at last that the greatest gift he ever gave her was not land hidden behind hills but a life hidden from noise. And if this story stayed with you, if it reminded you that the most powerful truths are often the quietest ones, then subscribe to the channel, because the stories shared here aren't just about what people own, but about who they choose to be.